Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here is your host, Sean Graham.
Hey, and welcome to History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from North Bay, Ontario. We're on the campus of Nipissing University, home of the Fightin' Lakers, which is where I actually got my undergraduate degree. I'm back in town as part of the History Department's lecture series. It's been a thrill to be able to come back. Really an honor to have the invitation, and I just couldn't be happier just to be here, and it's been a lot of fun to be back on campus. And one of the reasons why it was so much fun for me to be back on campus today, not just the opportunity to be part of the lecture series, but also the opportunity to talk to Katrina Srigley, noted women's historian. Now, for the full disclosure part of the podcast, is that Professor Srigley supervised my honors thesis when I was here in my fourth year. So it was great to be able to come back, see her, and talk to her a little bit. I think it was a great conversation. Hopefully you all agree with me. So here's my talk from earlier today with Katrina Srigley. So, Katrina Srigley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you,
Sean. Thanks for doing this.
I'm happy to be here.
I'm thrilled to be here. So it's very exciting. So just talking about women's history in general, it's not something that I'm particularly familiar with. I took one course while I was here in women's history. But in general, where do you think the discipline is today in 2013?
That's a really huge question.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have talked about the fact that you, in your own teaching, have found yourself drawing in issues of masculinity and femininity, mm-hmm. gender history, as well as women's history into the things that you're doing. So it's not something that you studied. It's not something that you focus on in your own research, but you're finding yourself teaching it and having students that are interested in it. So I think that that's a really great sign about where the discipline is. It's become normalized at a certain level so that students don't have to be convinced as much, I think, to see the relevance of these historical questions about women's experiences or about the impact of gender on people's lives and the lives of historical actors or the way that we think as a society or structure our society. Mm-hmm. So that's wonderful. And there's extent of publications in the field of women's and gender history. The journals, the engagement, I mean, I see that as being all very vibrant and excellent.
Yeah, because I was stunned. Like, teaching last semester, it's pop culture. And I put a question on the exam about something like describe how pop culture reflected concepts of masculinity and femininity. And out of the 45 students, like 35 of them answered that question. It was an optional question. I was stunned. One, because it was a question that when I was an undergrad, probably most students wouldn't have answered. And also because they had an option of 2 out of 4, and I pretty much had said that there was 2 other questions that would be on the exam without actually saying that. I hinted pretty heavily, so I was really surprised. And to me, it was a sign that, I talked about the concepts in my class, but it was a sign that in other classes that students are being exposed to a lot more. So in the past 10, 15 years, it seems as though it's become less niche and a lot more in sort of the mainstream. It's being incorporated in survey classes and stuff like this, whereas opposed it was just in dedicated classes. It's sort of my impression of it.
I would agree with that, and I think that the topics that emerged through women's history and through the work of scholars, historians, particularly in Canada, like Sylvia Van Kirk, like Gail Cuthbert-Brandt, like Andre Levesque, to focus us on the history of the family, the history of women's social worlds, their political activism, the questions we were asking, and are asking more in a standard way, not only in our teaching but in our research, weren't being asked in the 60s and 70s. In fact, it was an exceptional thing to suggest that either women in the fur trade or women nurses, women teachers were a relevant historical subject, or that the areas in which we find women most often in society, historically in the family, for instance, were relevant historical subjects. So in that sense, I agree with you that things have really, really changed. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the feminist goals of those early forerunners in our field have been fully realized. I don't know that there has been a fundamental structural change in the discipline in the way that that people maybe would have liked to see, like to see as we move forward.
Right.
But it's certainly more normalized.
Yes. Now, I think one of the main obstacles along this path to getting it more normalized then is, I think that there's a perception, if not in general, at least among some young men, that within women's history there's a hostility to men. And even in my experience taking the women's history course here, there was 50 students and 48 of them were women, and there was a sense that I got occasionally that I wasn't necessarily welcome in the room. Or when I gave my presentation, everyone had to give a presentation. When I gave mine, it seemed as though the questions were a little more, pointed, and it didn't seem like a very nice environment compared to other classes. So how do we deal with this perception that there is this hostility? Because I don't think it's real. I don't think there is I don't think that actually exists, but I think that there's a perception that it exists. And so how do we address that to get more men involved in studying women's history?
Well, one of the first responses, I think it's important to have, I'll say this, male students as well as female students in women's history classes. And in the classes I've taught, I do tend to have probably about between 5 and 10 out of a class of 50. Yes, that's in part a reflection of the student body at Nipissing.
Yes,
so
yes. What is it? Is it still 70%
of the student body,
which was great in every other aspect of my life here. But
but what I like to, if I'm able to have a conversation with the students, and in some classes it's not possible to try to have a conversation about what power dynamics mean in our lives,
right,
on the street, outside the classroom, and how they transfer inside the classroom.
Right.
So to say to those male students, imagine living in a world where 99% of the time you are the one who it has less power or less voice or feels ostracized or disempowered.
Right.
Bring that knowledge, that empathy, that awareness into this classroom, and then we can go anywhere with our discussions. So I resist engaging with that in such a way as to suggest that my male students are victimized in women's history because we perhaps explore issues of patriarchy that highlight the power that men historically and in the present day have in our society. So I resist that, casting the relationship in that way, while also being aware that you want to promote conversation and dialogue and positive relationships. And doing that doesn't mean excluding a particular group of people in your class, whether or not it's male students or non-Indigenous students, if you're talking about a topic that highlights racism or colonialism in the history of our country. So it's something that you have to think about pedagogically.
Yes. That
you cannot ignore, for sure. Yeah. But I don't see it as an obstacle.
All right. Which is good because, I mean, if and you didn't teach that class.
You'll let listeners
So
know.
I'll just say that. I mean, you didn't teach that class. So the person who taught that class was new to teaching as well and was a part-time professor. So I don't know if that had part of it, or maybe it was just the composition of the class.
It can be a myriad of factors.
There's so many
sometimes
things.
It works and sometimes it doesn't. But I also have to say, Sean, that across the student body, I still see, and this connects to your first question as well, a real resistance to feminism and to issues related to feminism. It's like people's backs get up. This is political. This is not what I'm in this classroom about. And so I always say, hang on here. Do you believe that you, female student, have as much right to be in this classroom as your colleague? Inevitably, the answer is yes, absolutely. Well, therefore, you are a feminist.
Right.
That is the basic definition of feminism. If you want to take that ideology in a more radical direction, if you want to engage in the political sphere, okay. If you want to see how feminism plays itself out in education, what it means historically, there are all kinds of avenues to explore feminism, but at its but to resist it is to resist what a movement that has brought women into the space that we're learning, that has given you, all of you, access to a different kind of classroom. And so
I think that gets lost sometimes because at the University of Ottawa there's been some controversy over the Women's Centre because one of the things that the Women's Centre has said, or in its or bylaws or whatever, it says that it's open to, it says something about pro-choice. It almost is like you have to be pro-choice in order to be part of the Women's Centre. And that sort of gets people's like that gets people like, well, what if you're not pro-choice but you're still a woman, like you're not welcome? And it was a bit of a controversy at the University of Ottawa for a little bit. And I think that's that mentality of this very hard line that people see when they see feminism, which is sort of a more, I don't want to say radicalized version of it, but it's not sort of the core principle of what feminism is, but that's what people associate with it unfairly.
And people associate pro-choice with pro-abortion.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't pro-choice, by virtue of its meaning, mean that people who choose in their lives not to support abortion are therefore but respect the right of other people to choose differently, would be encompassed in pro-choice. Right. So I do see, I think you're right, this blockage or an immediate red flag when these terms are used that indicates to me a lack of understanding about what it's all about and what the inspiration usually is.
So one of the ways in which you have tried to fix that misunderstanding or get people to understand more about it, your book, Breadwinning Daughters, Working Women in a Depression-Era City. And that Depression-era city is Toronto, in the case of the book. In general, and because I studied the 1930s, but the radio in the 1930s, so I'm familiar with Depression stuff. And generally what you think of or what you see with the Depression is unemployed men lining up on the street. And women don't tend to be included in the story at all. And why is that? Is it just part of the larger sort of historiographical issues in this country that women's history is sort of grown out of and taking or putting women back in the story? Or is there something specific to the Depression that has meant that women have been excluded from the story?
I think it is certainly historiographical. So the kinds of questions that were being asked about the Depression didn't include questions that were going to highlight women's stories or women's experiences. So that's very obvious in the historiography and has really changed in the last 10 years or so. Lara Campbell's work, Heidi MacDonald's work, there are lots of people who are now contributing to this discussion about women in the 30s. So absolutely historiographical. What else has gone on that's shone a lens more on the unemployed male? I think pop culture, movies, film, certainly tend to take the symbol of the hobo, the young male riding the rails, and have more often run with that as a principle driving trope, image, however you want to construct it, of pop culture that reflects that period. Right. So in John Steinbeck's work, you have a family, lots of women are part of that family, but the central figures there are absolutely male and unemployed males, and what the consequences of having unemployed males are for the family.
Right.
Having to be on the road, having to head west to California. So the Joad family story is told through principally male characters, even though Ma is important. The women are important.
Yeah.
So
like I look at I made my students watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Depression era movie, and so the Jimmy Stewart character of Mr. Smith is the hero of the movie, but it's Saunders, his assistant, who does really all the work. Yes, he does the filibuster at the end of the movie, but he doesn't know anything about the legislative process or anything. Like, she pushes the whole thing through, but but he's cast as the hero.
Yeah.
And he's the lens through which the story is told, even though in theory you could have anybody be that man, but you couldn't have that movie without the female character. So you could just see how it's put together through that lens.
Yeah, absolutely. The Grapes of Wrath is, as I've said, very, very similar. The famous images from the period. There are iconic ones of women, mothers in camps, but overwhelmingly the imagery is bread lines, male, unemployed males, unemployment lines, and those sorts of things. So I see both contributing in important ways. The historiographical trends, popular culture, the way in which the story has been told in wider society.
What sort of roles then were these young women playing in Toronto during the Depression? Because one of the focuses of the book is how young women were integral to keeping family units together, or thriving, or at least surviving through the Depression. So what sort of roles were they taking during these years?
They were working.
Yeah.
They're the ones who were able to find jobs in the economy of the Depression, where men were unable to find jobs.
Right.
As long as they were single women, so 15 to 30, 35 were the women, young single women who were be able to find jobs in the garment industry, in clerical work. Only 3% were finding jobs in teaching, but if a family had a young daughter who was a teacher, then they were really, really stable during the Depression with her wages. So that's the principal way that the women that I interviewed were, what they were doing, and the story that they told of themselves as breadwinners didn't change their understanding of what breadwinner meant in our society in the 30s. The breadwinner was still a male role. They didn't adopt that themselves. But when they worked through their stories and shared their stories, it became clear that, in fact, aside from the characteristic of being female and the daughters, that they were the ones who were bringing home the money, putting food on the table, clothing their family, their younger siblings, making sacrifices themselves to ensure that those kinds of things happen. So aside from the very important gender connotation around breadwinner, they were doing all of those things to keep their families as stable and as comfortable as possible in the 30s.
And one of the things, I read a couple of reviews, and one of the reviewers pointed out that they really liked when you talked about how the women had to go against the normal grain and delay marriage and stay with their parents and that family, their nuclear family, I guess, and sort of delay what was at the time the common experience of going out and getting married, because if they got married, they couldn't have worked anymore.
That's right.
And then their economic contribution goes away, which really hurts the family, which is, to me, it's a really interesting point, and reflecting changing gender roles and during this period, and how the need to survive or the economic realities has outweighed pretty much everything else, the social norms, and then in my case, the cultural situation. It's just really an interesting way to look at the Depression.
And women felt those experiences still very acutely 70 years later. So when they're sharing their memories with me, the fact that they had to give up going to school, that they had to delay marriage or could never get married to the men. It was, in the stories they shared with me, always with some very few exceptions, men that they weren't able to sustain a relationship with or go develop a family with, because they had to sacrifice for their families. The clear exception that I found where economics didn't trump everything was within for non-white women.
Right.
So African Canadian women weren't able to provide for their families as much, commiserate with their education, because race prevented them from finding jobs in office work. Even though they had gone to school and trained to be office workers, they still had to take on factory work or domestic jobs. So they were being breadwinners, but their economic contribution was limited by race.
Right. So so again, this is another thing where, like, getting back to sort of the original point of like women's history, where we tend to just think of women's history as women's history, but it's it's at least a chapter, right, of the ethnicity aspect of it, which, like, you can't treat women as this homogenous group of women. Ethnicity plays a role, and so non-white women don't have the same opportunities as white women in the Depression. So, what kind of, you mentioned a little bit they didn't have the same opportunities, but what kind of opportunities did they have, and was there any comment on this, that they didn't have equal opportunities as white women?
It was certainly very clear in the sharing of their stories that race created inequality within Toronto, within Canadian society, North American society. Absolutely. I mean, we can very clearly make those leaps from a city urban center in the 1930s to other North American urban centers, to North America as a whole. So race mattered. There was absolutely no question about the fact that our conversations were going to be in some way, about how that impacted the experiences they had in the 30s. So work is a dominant story for anybody who's talking about the 30s, because of economic insecurity, lack of access to jobs, going through school, graduating from high school, which was, many of the women that I interviewed couldn't even finish high school because you still had to pay for your textbooks. If your family wanted to send you out to work, needed your money, so that you gave up high school. So for some of these women, finishing high school, graduating from Central Tech or Harvard Collegiate, winning medals, academic medals, thinking, okay, so now here I am, it's 1932, I'm going to go and get a work at Simpsons, or I'll work as an office worker in one of the insurance companies. I have all of these skills. I clearly am very good at what I do. And just having the door slammed in their faces. Right. And being told, it's because you're black. Sorry. We can't hire you, and the other workers won't work with you. The one story that Claire Clark shared with me on more than one occasion, and I interviewed her 15 times or something. It was marvelous. She, the manager of the department, one of the departments in Simpsons, where she hoped that she would be able to go and find a job soon after graduating high school, was a man of mixed race. So he had Caribbean. One of his parents was from the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean, and he also denied her a job.
Wow.
So she worked through, in sharing her stories, her anger at that, but also her understanding that for her he had passed in the white world. So she knew his ancestry, other people perhaps didn't. He was making the best of the situation for himself. So the tension in her feeling of betrayal. Yeah. She was from Barbados, also, but knowing that, because when people looked at her, they saw her race before they saw anything else, and that she could not get work. And this, in all of the interviews that I was lucky enough to listen to from other people that had conducted them, or that I conducted myself, was very clear that race, we have to talk about race, because it shaped our world in the 30s. Once the war hits, then African Canadian women are welcomed into factories, right? Things start to open up out of necessity in a different way. And for Claire, to go back to that interview, that this was an important moment for her. Even she recognized that it was happening for reasons which perhaps weren't as inspirational as one might hope, but she knew that this was an important moment for her, and suddenly her parents didn't have to take in boarders, her mom didn't have to clean houses. It changed their life because she could do that, and her peers who were white were able to do more of that in the 30s than she was.
I want to talk about these interviews a little bit, because clearly from even just the couple stories you've told, they're very powerful, and the emotions that, like, the women still carry these emotions. They haven't dissipated, even though these interviews are being done 70 years later in some cases. Now, in doing these interviews, did you get a sense that the women, had a goal in telling these stories? And, in the same way that women's history maybe is trying to reclaim women's place in the story, are they conscious of that effort themselves, or are they just telling their story because it's their story, it's a personal story, and they're invested in it? I mean, or what is the goal for them in doing an interview?
I wouldn't say that there was an homogenous goal. I would say there were a variety of goals. Yeah. One of them absolutely was, I'm going to tell the story of women's experiences. Why don't we hear about women's experiences? Why do we hear about the unemployed male? Exactly what you said previously. So that was a narrative running through the more than 100 interviews that I conducted, for sure. Yeah. Then there is the desire to share your life story, the reflection that happens when you're in your 80s, 70s, and 80s. It's a well-known stage in people's sense of self, that you get to that point in your life and you go through a period of reflecting on who you are, where you've been, where you are now. Yep. So to share your life narrative from, this is where I was born, this is my family. The life narrative interview is very meaningful for people who want to engage in that process. Yes. A third thing I would add, which most of us are lucky enough to have experienced at least at some point in our life, is the grandparent, grandchild passing on of knowledge, or elder, community member, family member passing on of knowledge. So I was of the age at the point when these interviews are happening. I'm in my mid-20s. I'm the age of their grandchildren. They really saw me as a young person who was listening to them, and they loved it. They loved to pass on knowledge to the next generation, and that knowledge would maybe one day end up in a book was just that was cool to them. But the act of sitting together and sharing the conversation was very, very meaningful. Yeah,
and even though you're not their family, it's still a powerful experience for you too, right? To hear some of these stories. Yes. Yeah, I still have one set of grandparents who are alive, and the other ones have passed. And I know my grandmother on my father's side, she kept a diary in the late 30s, early 40s, and a few years ago, we gave it to my cousin because she was the only granddaughter. And my aunt, her sister, my grandmother's sister was there, and we were flipping through the diary. This was when she was a late teenager, I think, and there was stuff about dates that she had gone on. And my aunt is telling the stories, like, I remember that guy. He was kind of nice. Just being there, it's kind of cool that she can remember all these guys, like all this, and not just the guys, but other events and stuff. It was a really cool experience to be in the room, all of us. And just telling these stories, it was really powerful, and just to hear these stories of the past. It's one of the reasons why I love history.
Yes, me too. I love the stories.
Now we're running out of time, which makes me sad because I could talk about this kind of stuff all day. But before we go, I want to talk just briefly about Finding a Way to the Heart. Feminist Writings on Aboriginal and Women's History in Canada. Now, this book came out last year. It's a collaboration, and it's edited by Valerie Kornick of Saskatchewan, the University of Saskatchewan, and Robin Jarvis Brownlee of the University of Manitoba. And you have an entry in it called Issues of Identity and Status in Northern Ontario After Bill C-31. And then there's at least 10 chapters in it.
The first part of that article is the more powerful. The title is "I am a proud Anishinaabe."
Okay. Well, I missed that. Sorry.
The opening of that, which gives the
yes. Just in general. So the book, it's on the publisher site. It talks about Sylvia Van Kirk, and it's sort of born out of Sylvia Van Kirk's.
It's a fresh shrift for Sylvia. Yeah.
Now, so for anyone who doesn't know, what is Sylvia Van Kirk? What was her work? What is her significance in Canadian history?
Well,
if you can do that in
2 minutes, 2 minutes or less.
In 90 seconds.
I'll give it my best shot. Well, I'll tell you, Sean, that all of us in some way, shape, or form, or the majority of us, were students of Sylvia's at the University of Toronto, or in Toronto at universities at the time when Sylvia was active in the history department at the University of Toronto. So some were of the contributors were at York. Many Tender Ties, which was published in 1980 and was a culmination of Sylvia Van Kirk's PhD work. She was working on her PhD alongside Jennifer Brown at the same time, placed women in fur trade history, Indigenous women in fur trade history, in a way that they had never been placed before. And I love the story that Sylvia shares about calling the archives, the Hudson's Bay Company archives, then in London, saying to them she wanted to study women in the fur trade. And the archivist laughing at her, saying, well, first of all, there's already somebody here at the archives who's asking that question. So it's
covered.
So it's covered.
Yeah,
it's covered. And I don't think you're going to find much anyway. And that was Jennifer Brown, who was doing her work, Strangers in Blood. So Sylvia went anyway, which says lots about Sylvia. They become lifelong friends, and Many Tender Ties is the result. And I would say that there are two lasting things about Many Tender Ties that we still turn to, that as scholars of women's and gender history we can still turn to for our work today. One is methodological. So you find people, voices, issues in sources you don't expect to find them in by reading them against the grain. So those Hudson's Bay Company, the records from the chief factors, the wills, the daily journals, Indigenous women were in those journals, but nobody saw them there.
Right.
So to take sources that we've understood to only speak to the history of men or the history of something like the Hudson's Bay Company is one major contribution. The second one is placing Indigenous women at the center of a history that had previously silenced them. And we still need to do that in Canadian history. We still need to not only think methodologically and epistemologically about the stories of Indigenous women in our past, but also about their experiences in all of the over the centuries, and how that might change our understanding of pivotal times, pivotal moments like the fur trade. So Sylvia, Many Tender Ties is still a really key book in the field. Published in 1980, and here we are in 2013. You can't say that about a lot of books.
So and I went to the launch last year, which was at the part of the CHA, and just hearing her talk about it and the experience, and getting back to what I said about this inclusivity and getting over this perception of hostility to men. I mean, she was very clear and about her approach, and so I haven't gone through the book yet, but I look forward to going through and sort of seeing the fruits of that ideology or her methodology and seeing it all come together. So, so the two books then, we have Breadwinning Daughters, Young Working Women in a Depression-Era City, which is yours, and then the collaboration, Finding a Way to the Heart, Feminist Writings on Aboriginal and Women's History in Canada. Katrina Srigley, thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Sean.
So there you have it. My conversation from earlier today with Katrina Srigley. My only regret is that we didn't have more time, but I really enjoyed that conversation with her. So my thanks to Katrina Srigley for doing it. I also want to send a quick shout out and a big thank you to Anne Clendenning, Derek Neal, and Robin Gendron here at Nipissing University for helping to organize the lecture series and having me here today. It really has been a huge thrill for me to come back to Nipissing, a place that will always be close to my heart. I love this school, and it's been just an honor and a privilege for me to be able to come back here. It's been a lot of fun. If you have any questions, comments about the podcasts, you can find me historyslam@gmail.com, Twitter @Dr. Shawnee Fever, and if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Check out ActiveHistory.ca for more features and articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.